are going to decide your destiny and how you want your housing to be. This is no longer in the hands of outsiders. This is in the hands of insiders, those who live in NYCHA.
Welcome back to Inside City Hall. That was Mayor Adams speaking to tenants at the Nostrand Houses in Brooklyn yesterday. Tenants there are in the middle of a historic vote to decide whether to become the first public housing development in our city to join the Public Housing Preservation Trust. Under the trust, the complex will gain access to more funding, which will go toward making critical repairs. The estimated cost to rehabilitate all 16 buildings of the Nostrand Houses is about $600 million. Residents also have two other options on the ballot besides choosing the trust. They can select to join other public housing units that have been converted to private management, or they can continue the current status quo through federal funding under Section 9 public housing. Tenants have until next Thursday to cast their ballots. And joining me now to talk about that and much more is the CEO of our city's housing authority, Lisa Bova-Hiatt. Welcome back to the program. Always good to see you.
Thank you for having me.
Why is Nostrand Avenue or Nostrand Houses the first to have this option?
You know, the Tenant Association president really advocated to have Nostrand be the first, plus $600 million worth of capital need. It really just seemed like a perfect fit.
We cover elections a lot around here, and the conduct of the elections can get very minutely detailed, and it starts to matter when people feel like the election maybe wasn't as fair as they would have liked. How are people voting? Is it electronic? Is it a piece of paper? How are you doing that?
So we had first 100 days of engagement, which was really great. We did door knocking, we had robocalls, we had in-person meetings. And when we started the voting process 20 days ago, people had the ability to vote online, vote by mail, and yesterday started in-person voting. And we have a third-party voting administrator that's administering the vote. And the excitement at Nostrand yesterday was just wonderful.
What are the major selling points for tenants to join the Preservation Trust as opposed to Pact or doing nothing?
Well, I think, you know, doing nothing is the status quo. And we know that the status quo isn't really working when you look at our $78 billion capital need. Both the trust and Pact, I think both are wins for our tenants. The trust is a purely public model. We listened to our tenants who said, you know, Pact is the privatization, which we know NYCHA always remains the owner of the property, whether the properties go through the trust or through Pact. But the trust is new and it's novel. And I think that there are a lot of people who really are just excited to be a part of it.
Why was status quo, why was Section 9 even offered as an option? I thought the premise of all of this was that the status quo was not working.
Well, we believe the status quo is not working. We know that we're not getting an influx of close to $80 billion from Washington, D.C., but there are a lot of NYCHA residents who feel very strongly about Section 9. They feel the most protected, even though all of their rights that they currently have under Section 9 will be transferred whether they choose Pact or they choose the trust.
Right. I mean, the status quo, I mean, not to overly simplify it, but like you have the rights, but you don't have the funding, right? And the buildings are falling apart. Whichever path the tenants choose, the development has, over my understanding, 1,000 units across 16 buildings. Where will the tenants go while the repairs are being made?
So it remains to be seen, depending on what repairs are done. Once they choose a path, the residents will then work with either the trust or our Pact partners to figure out a scope. What, you know, infrastructure is going to be changed, and then depending on that, depending on the type of environmental remediation that needs to be done, they will either be moved throughout the development, they could stay in place. That's something to be determined.
And if they do select the Preservation Trust, would the trust be hiring an outside firm to make this happen, or will it be?
Absolutely.
Yeah. So
Absolutely.
In some ways, the difference between Pact and the trust is not necessarily that great. They could end up being similar in outcome.
The fundamental difference is that NYCHA will manage the properties after they have been rehabilitated if they choose the trust path. And if they choose the Pact path, they are managed by outside private management companies.
What's the timeline for other complexes to have their opportunities to vote?
Well, we're going to be shortly, within the next week or so, announcing the next trust voting site. And we know that 2024, we will be announcing more properties. We have a cap of 25,000 apartments. Pursuant to the trust legislation, but we know that next year is just going to continue to build momentum around the trust. Okay.
Let me switch topics and ask you about some other things. NYCHA has completed over $24 million worth of security enhancements at a series of 23 campuses, mostly in Brooklyn, I think. Farragut, it says here, Kingsborough, Pink Houses, and so forth. What made that happen, and what difference will tenants see as a result of these enhancements?
Well, I think that cameras are always incredibly helpful. People feel secure when they know that their door locks, when they know that they have cameras. And it was through funding that we received through the city council, through the city, and through other sources.
And what's the timeline for getting them installed? It sounds like a lot.
Well, you know what? Everything that we do takes time. Right now, we have over 500 capital projects going on simultaneously. When we get to the end of 2023, I think we would have spent $1 billion in capital projects just across the portfolio through this year alone. So I would think this is something that we're going to prioritize.
Well, something you and I talked about last time you were here. These numbers are coming from the city, the news organization. As of the end of June, 70,000 out of 151,000 public housing households were behind in their rent. An unprecedented level of arrears that's over $500 million. What is the plan to get that back? If 46% of households are behind, and the average amount is actually in the multiple thousands, 7,000 I think was the average, how are you going to get that money back?
So one of the things that we talked about was the fact that we were waiting for ERAP funds to come through the state. When you are $7,000 in arrears and your average household income is $25,000, that's an insurmountable amount. But when we're able to credit their accounts the year's worth of rent that they'll get through ERAP, connect them with other social services, one-shot deals, and other private funding sources like Catholic Charities, we're hoping that people will get into the habit, the cadence again, of paying rent.
But I mean, a key part of that is also, if you're $7,000 in arrears and you know that they're not going to evict you, then it can just go on indefinitely, right?
Well, I mean, I think our tenants know that in order for us to do the work that we do, in order for us to provide them services, the money that we receive in rent is a third of our operating dollars. So paying rent is an integral part of being a tenant, especially being a tenant in subsidized housing. And we are very hopeful that once they see the influx of money that they should have gotten, you know, over 2 years ago, that they will be incentivized to pay the rent again.
You can't be the biggest landlord and the only landlord in New York that's operating on the honor system, right? I mean, I'm trying to find some consequences for people who, for whatever reason, just haven't paid their rent.
Well, we actually have brought tenants to court, and we will continue to do that. That's a last resort for us. Our mission as a public housing authority is to keep people housed. But if you're not paying your rent, then there has to be consequences.
Right.
And I know that our property managers have been calling people in, you know, giving them the requisite letters that we need to in order to bring a person to court for non-payment. You know, the courts, as you know, are incredibly backlogged since the lifting of the eviction moratorium. So we are proceeding on every option, but we are incredibly hopeful that once the ERAP money comes through, that people again will get back into the cadence.
And were people, by the way, are people able to vote about whether or not to be in Pact or Section 9 or the Preservation Trust without regard to whether or not they're in arrears?
As long as you are the head of household or over 18 and on the lease, you are eligible to vote.
Okay. Thank you very much, Lisa Bova-Hiatt. Great to see you. Let's take a break now. When we come back, we'll talk about the ongoing legal woes facing Mayor Adams and much more when I'm joined by my politics panel. Stay with us.